The waitress returned a rusted house key. The billionaire suddenly stopped speaking. Sometimes the smallest thing a person loses is the very thing they never stopped searching for. Rain drifted gently across the streets of Burlington, Vermont, turning the sidewalks into mirrors that reflected the warm lights of Willow Street Cafe. Inside, conversations floated softly above the quiet clink of porcelain cups and silverware, while the comforting aroma of fresh coffee settled over every table. Hannah Miller adjusted the strings of her black apron and wiped the polished wooden counter one final time before the evening rush faded into peaceful silence. At 36, she carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had learned that kindness did not need witnesses. She greeted every customer with the same gentle smile, whether they ordered homemade soup or simply sat alone with a cup of coffee and their thoughts. Near the window, Edward Whittaker buttoned his charcoal overcoat before leaving. At 67, the billionaire was known throughout New England for restoring historic buildings and quietly donating to community projects. Yet few people noticed how slowly he now walked or how often he paused before stepping into an empty car waiting outside. His meal was finished. His coffee had gone cold. He thanked Hannah with polite distance and disappeared into the rainy evening. 10 minutes later, while clearing his table, Hannah noticed something resting beneath the chair leg. It was a small rusted house key attached to a faded leather strap worn smooth by decades of use. It was far too old to belong on the electronic key ring of a modern businessman. She picked it up carefully. The metal felt unexpectedly warm despite the cool air, and across its weathered surface a tiny engraved oak leaf remained just visible beneath years of rust. Hannah stood quietly for a moment. She could have placed it in the restaurant's lost and found drawer with forgotten umbrellas and reading glasses. Instead, something about the worn key made her slip off her apron, grab her dark blue winter coat, and hurry outside into the rain. She spotted Edward just before his driver closed the rear passenger door. "Sir," she called gently. Edward turned, surprised to see the waitress jogging toward him with raindrops gathering in her hair. Slightly out of breath, Hannah extended her open hand. "I believe this belongs to you." Edward looked down. The instant he saw the rusted key, every trace of expression disappeared from his face. His hand reached toward it but stopped halfway, trembling almost too slightly to notice. The driver quietly stepped back without speaking. The street seemed to fall silent around them. Edward finally accepted the key with both hands instead of one, as though it weighed far more than its small size suggested. He stared at the tiny oak leaf engraved on its surface, and for several long seconds he said nothing at all. Hannah did not interrupt the silence. She simply waited beneath the rain, watching a man who possessed more houses than most people could imagine stand speechless before a single old key that no longer appeared capable of opening any ordinary door. And she found herself wondering what kind of home could still live inside one person's heart after so many years of being locked away. The next afternoon sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Willow Street Cafe, casting long golden patterns across the polished wooden floor where generations of footsteps had quietly worn the varnish smooth. Hannah arrived early as she always did, hanging her dark blue winter coat on the familiar hook behind the kitchen door before tying the strings of her black apron with practiced hands. She paused beside the small bulletin board where the owner displayed photographs of longtime customers celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary afternoons that somehow deserved to be remembered. She gently straightened one crooked frame before carrying a fresh pot of coffee into the dining room. It was a habit no one had ever asked her to keep. Across town, Edward Whittaker stood alone in the library of Whittaker Hall. The rusted house key rested beside the faded photograph of the white farmhouse and the untouched porcelain coffee cup from breakfast. Morning meetings had been canceled without explanation. His assistants assumed another business emergency had demanded his attention. Instead, Edward spent nearly an hour quietly turning pages of old family albums spread across the mahogany desk. Most photographs showed holidays, birthdays, and smiling relatives whose names younger generations no longer remembered. Then his hand stopped. One photograph showed his mother standing on the porch of the farmhouse, holding the rusted key in one hand while smiling toward the camera. Beside her, hanging on the porch wall, was a wooden plaque carved with a single sentence. "Home is where forgiveness waits the longest." Edward stared at those words until they blurred slightly. He could not remember the last time he had thought about that porch, or why he had never gone back after his mother's funeral. Something inside him shifted, not with sudden revelation but with quiet regret. By late afternoon, he found himself walking back into Willow Street Cafe instead of attending a board meeting. Hannah looked up from serving an elderly couple and greeted him with the same warm smile she offered every customer. There was no curiosity in her expression, no expectation that yesterday's strange moment deserved an explanation. She simply poured fresh coffee into a clean porcelain cup and placed it before him. Edward remained silent for several moments before removing the rusted key from his coat pocket and laying it gently on the table between them. "Do you ever keep things?" he asked softly. "Even when they hurt to remember?" Hannah looked at the key before glancing toward the old photographs hanging on the cafe wall. "Every family has something they cannot throw away," she answered quietly. "Sometimes it is because the object reminds us of joy. Sometimes it reminds us of the person we still hope to become." Edward lowered his eyes without speaking. Hannah did not ask what the key opened. She did not ask why his hand trembled when he touched it. Instead, she quietly refilled his coffee after noticing it had begun to cool. The gesture was so ordinary that most people would never have remembered it. Yet Edward found himself watching the steam rise slowly between them, wondering why a waitress who knew nothing about his past seemed to understand the weight he had carried for decades better than anyone who had shared his name. The following Saturday arrived wrapped in bright autumn sunshine, the kind of morning that invited people to slow down without realizing why. Willow Street Cafe filled steadily with familiar faces, retirees lingering over newspapers, young families sharing pancakes, and neighbors greeting one another as though the little restaurant had become part of everyone's weekly routine. Hannah moved quietly between the tables in her neatly pressed black apron, refilling coffee cups before anyone needed to ask and gently straightening a birthday card that had slipped sideways beside an elderly couple celebrating 58 years of marriage. She believed little things deserved attention because little things often carried the greatest love. Just before noon, Edward Whittaker walked through the front door carrying neither a briefcase nor business papers. Instead, he held the faded family photograph from the farmhouse inside a simple leather folder. His charcoal jacket seemed less formal today, and for the first time since Hannah had met him, he looked less like a man arriving for a meeting than someone returning to a place he quietly trusted. Hannah welcomed him with the same warm smile she offered every guest and poured fresh coffee into the familiar porcelain cup before he even reached for the menu. Edward thanked her with a gentle nod that no longer carried the distance of wealth. After a few quiet moments, he placed the old photograph carefully on the table. "Would you look at something with me?" he asked softly. Hannah wiped her hands on a folded linen towel before sitting across from him only after the owner signaled that the dining room was calm. Edward opened the photograph. The white farmhouse stood beneath 2 oak trees exactly as it had decades earlier. Hannah studied it slowly, never rushing. Her eyes paused on the wooden key rack beside the front door, then drifted lower toward a worn rocking chair resting on the porch. She leaned a little closer. "Someone sat there every day," she said almost to herself. Edward looked surprised. "How do you know?" Hannah smiled gently. "The wood beneath the left arm is smoother than the rest. Years of one hand resting there." Edward lowered his eyes to the photograph. He had never noticed it. Suddenly he remembered his mother sitting on that porch every Sunday afternoon with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her while she waited for him to visit after college. She never complained when he canceled. She simply waited again the following week. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the photograph before relaxing once more. Hannah quietly slid the picture back toward him without another word. She understood that memories sometimes needed silence more than conversation. Outside the cafe window, golden leaves drifted slowly across the sidewalk, while inside the steam from Edward's untouched coffee curled gently upward between them. He looked from the old photograph to the rusted key resting beside his cup, then back to Hannah with gratitude he could not yet fully express. Hannah simply stood and returned to serving the next table, leaving him alone with the picture, the coffee, and a memory that no longer asked why he had stayed away. but whether it might still be possible for someone to find their way home before love stopped waiting. Monday arrived with clear blue skies, and the cool autumn air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves through the streets of Burlington. Willow Street Cafe welcomed its regular customers with familiar warmth, the windows slightly fogged from fresh coffee and homemade bread. Hannah hung her dark blue winter coat behind the kitchen door, tied her black apron with practiced hands, and paused for a brief moment beside the old photograph on the bulletin board near the entrance. She gently straightened the frame once again before carrying a fresh pot of coffee into the dining room. Some habits were so quiet that no one noticed them until they stopped. Late that afternoon, Edward returned, not alone this time, but accompanied by his longtime attorney, who quietly carried a leather portfolio filled with documents. The attorney looked around the small cafe with polite curiosity while Edward asked for the same table beside the window. Hannah greeted them with the same calm kindness she offered every guest, placing 2 porcelain coffee cups on the table before pouring fresh coffee with steady hands. After the attorney stepped away to answer a phone call outside, Edward carefully removed the rusted house key from his pocket and laid it beside the faded farmhouse photograph. He looked toward Hannah with an expression that carried more humility than authority. "Would you be willing to see the house with me?" he asked softly. Hannah did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the old photograph, then at the key, and finally at the steam rising gently from the coffee between them. "Why me?" she asked with quiet honesty. Edward smiled sadly. "Because everyone else keeps telling me what the property is worth." His fingers rested lightly on the worn key. "You were the first person who wondered what it meant." Hannah lowered her eyes for a moment. She remembered her father's words that every invitation carried a responsibility, especially when it involved another family's memories. She reached for the receipt lying beside the coffee cup, folded it absent-mindedly into a small square, then placed it back on the table exactly as it had been. It gave her a few extra seconds to think. "I would not come to judge your past," she said gently, "only to help you see it, if that is truly what you want." Edward nodded without hesitation. "That is exactly what I need." The attorney returned quietly, surprised to find neither business contracts nor negotiations taking place. Instead, he watched the billionaire carefully slide the leather portfolio aside, leaving only the old photograph, the rusted key, and 2 slowly cooling coffee cups between them. No legal document on the table seemed as important as those ordinary objects. Hannah rose to serve another family celebrating a little girl's birthday nearby, placing the cake gently before them while everyone sang with joyful laughter. Edward watched the celebration in silence. For years he had spent birthdays inside boardrooms and airports, believing there would always be another family dinner waiting. As the little girl hugged her grandfather beside the birthday cake, Edward quietly looked back at the rusted key. For the first time, he realized that opening an old front door might be far easier than reopening the years he had quietly left behind, and Hannah found herself wondering whether accepting one simple invitation might become the kindest thing she had ever done for someone who had forgotten where home truly began. Morning light drifted gently through the farmhouse windows, touching the worn wooden floor with the same quiet warmth that had greeted Edward as a child decades earlier. Hannah moved slowly through the house, never opening a drawer without permission, never lifting an object simply because it looked old. She treated every room as though someone had only stepped outside for a few minutes and might return at any moment. Edward watched her from the kitchen doorway, noticing how naturally she respected a place that held memories belonging to someone else. On the kitchen table, the porcelain coffee cup still rested beside the faded embroidered runner exactly where they had found it. Hannah brushed a few grains of dust from the table with the edge of her sleeve before smiling softly. "Your mother liked morning light," she said. Edward looked toward the window. "She always opened those curtains before sunrise." His voice carried a tenderness he had not heard in himself for years. Together they walked into the small sitting room where the old rocking chair still faced the front porch. Beside it stood a narrow bookcase, and tucked carefully between 2 weathered cookbooks, Hannah noticed the corner of a cream-colored envelope. She did not reach for it. Instead, she quietly looked toward Edward. "Would you like to see what is there?" she asked. Edward stepped forward, his hand hesitating for only a moment before gently removing the envelope. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting that time had softened but never erased, were 4 simple words. For Edward, when ready. He closed his eyes. His thumb rested lightly against the paper as though afraid even the smallest movement might disturb the years that had protected it. Hannah remained near the window, giving him the privacy that grief deserves. After a long silence, Edward unfolded the letter. His mother's words were calm, almost conversational. She wrote that she understood why ambition had carried him far from home. She hoped success would bring him joy, but she prayed it would never convince him that love could wait forever. She explained that she had left the old key where it always belonged because every home should have one door that remained ready for the people who needed forgiveness more than permission. By the time Edward reached the final sentence, tears rested quietly in his eyes without falling. He folded the letter with the same care his mother had once used when writing it. "She never blamed me," he whispered. Hannah looked toward the old photograph on the mantel showing a younger Edward standing between his parents beneath the oak trees. "The people who love us most often spend less time keeping score than we imagine," she answered gently. Edward smiled through the silence that followed. For the first time in many years, regret no longer felt like punishment. It felt like an invitation to live differently. As they prepared to leave, Hannah picked up the empty coffee cup from the kitchen table, washed it carefully in the old porcelain sink, dried it with a folded linen towel, and placed it back in exactly the same spot where Edward's mother had left it. He noticed the quiet gesture and understood immediately. Some things were not preserved because they were fragile. They were preserved because they reminded us how gently love had once lived there, and as he slipped the rusted key back into his pocket beside the folded letter, he found himself wondering not whether his mother had forgiven him, but whether he was finally ready to forgive himself. Several weeks passed before the old farmhouse welcomed voices again. The autumn leaves had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson, and sunlight spilled across the porch where the weathered rocking chair still faced the long gravel road. This time Edward did not arrive alone. His daughter stepped out first, followed by his 2 grandchildren carrying baskets filled with fresh bread, apples, and flowers gathered from a nearby farm stand. Their laughter felt unfamiliar inside the quiet yard, as though the house itself had almost forgotten the sound. Hannah arrived a little later after finishing her morning shift at Willow Street Cafe. Her dark blue winter coat rested neatly over one arm, and beneath it she carried a warm apple pie her father had insisted she bring. She hesitated near the porch until Edward noticed her. Instead of greeting her with the formal politeness of their first meeting, he walked toward her with an easy smile and accepted the pie with both hands, the same way he had once accepted the rusted key. It was a small gesture, but it carried far more gratitude than words ever could. Inside the house, the family gathered around the old kitchen table. The porcelain coffee cup Hannah had carefully washed days earlier remained beside the window, now joined by several fresh cups filled with steaming coffee. Edward unfolded his mother's letter once more, not because everyone needed to hear every word, but because he wanted his grandchildren to understand why the house mattered. When he finished reading, no one rushed to speak. His granddaughter quietly stood and placed the faded family photograph in the center of the table beside the rusted key. "Can we leave them together?" she asked softly. Edward smiled. "That is where they belong." Hannah looked around the room. The walls had not changed. The furniture remained worn. The paint still showed the passing of time. Yet everything felt different because people had returned before memories disappeared completely. Edward reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed an envelope. Hannah immediately recognized it as the same one that had remained untouched since their conversation at the cafe. "This is not payment," he said gently before handing it to her. "It is an invitation." Inside was a handwritten note asking Hannah and her father to join the Whitaker family for Sunday supper whenever they wished. There was no check, no contract, no obligation, only a place at the table. Hannah's eyes rested quietly on the invitation before she looked back at Edward. For years she had believed accepting kindness might somehow diminish the dignity of giving it. Standing in that old farmhouse, she realized generosity could travel in both directions. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into the same pocket where she often carried small family keepsakes. Outside, the oak trees stirred gently in the afternoon breeze while the front door remained open, the rusted key resting in its old lock from the inside. It no longer stood for something that had been lost. It had become a quiet reminder that the strongest homes are not built by the doors we close, but by the hearts we finally allow to come back inside. Several months later, the first snowfall of winter settled gently across the old farmhouse, covering the roof, the fence, and the winding country road in quiet white. Nothing about the house looked grand, yet it no longer looked abandoned. Warm light glowed through the front windows every Sunday evening, and the porch that had once waited in silence now welcomed familiar footsteps once again. Edward Whittaker no longer measured the passing of time by board meetings or investment reports. Instead, he measured it by family dinners, grandchildren racing across the front yard beneath the oak trees, and the comforting sound of the old front door opening without hesitation. The rusted house key remained in the lock on the inside of the door, exactly where his mother had intended it to stay. It was no longer hidden inside a pocket or forgotten inside an expensive coat. It had become a quiet reminder that home was never something to possess. It was something to return to. On one wall of the living room hung the faded family photograph beside his mother's handwritten letter, both framed with simple wood rather than expensive glass. Visitors often noticed them before they noticed anything else. Edward preferred it that way. He wanted every person who entered the house to understand what truly mattered before seeing anything of value. Hannah still worked at Willow Street Cafe. Every Saturday morning she arrived wearing the same dark blue winter coat before tying on her familiar black apron. The old bulletin board still displayed photographs of ordinary people celebrating ordinary moments. One afternoon, the owner quietly added another picture. It showed several generations of the Whittaker family gathered around the farmhouse kitchen table, smiling beside fresh coffee, homemade pie, and the old porcelain cup that had remained on the windowsill for so many years. Hannah looked at the photograph for a long moment before gently straightening its frame, just as she always had. She smiled, not because anyone had thanked her publicly, but because the picture proved that one family's silence had finally become conversation again. Later that day, Edward entered the cafe carrying no briefcase, no business folder, and no forgotten belongings. He ordered the same cup of coffee and the same slice of apple pie he now requested every Saturday. When Hannah placed the receipt beside his cup, he picked up his pen and wrote a short note before quietly folding it once. As he stood to leave, he placed the folded receipt beneath the empty coffee cup exactly as he had once left unfinished meetings behind. After he stepped into the falling snow, Hannah cleared the table and unfolded the receipt. There was no generous tip written across it, no business offer, and no promise of reward. There were only 6 simple words written carefully in steady handwriting. "Thank you for bringing me home again." Hannah folded the receipt with the same care she once used for family letters and slipped it inside the small keepsake box waiting on the bookshelf beside her father's old photograph. It did not belong there because it was valuable. It belonged there because it carried a promise that had finally been fulfilled. Outside, snow continued to fall across the quiet streets, while families gathered around dinner tables throughout the town. Somewhere beyond the glowing windows of the farmhouse, laughter drifted through rooms that had once echoed only with memory. Edward had learned that gratitude could open doors money never could. Hannah had learned that accepting kindness did not weaken dignity but completed it. And the old rusted key, which seemed so ordinary on a rainy evening outside a neighborhood cafe, had never truly been waiting to unlock a house. It had been waiting for 2 hearts to remember that the longest journey any person ever makes is the one that leads gently back home.